Welcome to The Truth About Vaccines. I'm your host, Ty Bollinger. Now, you may recognize me from documentaries that I produced in the past on the subject of the truth about cancer. A natural progression was to investigate the truth about vaccines and bring awareness to that topic as well. And that's exactly what we've done. I truly believe that the next 7 days are going to change your life, and I look forward to going on this journey with you. So let's go ahead and get started. It's a commonly held belief that people, including doctors, are either pro-vaccine, in other words, they believe that all vaccines are safe and effective for all people all the time, or anti-vaccine, in other words, 100% against all vaccines all the time. But is this accurate? Are these the only two legitimate positions about vaccines?
It's absolutely ridiculous to even talk in terms of pro or anti-vaccine. The reason why is that it would be like talking in terms of pro or anti-antibiotic. So you can know that it's absolutely wonderful to have access to antibiotics when you need them, when they're being used appropriately, when there's a bacterial infection that an antibiotic can really help beat. That doesn't mean that you would prescribe an antibiotic for a viral infection. But somebody, a doctor or a parent who didn't want an antibiotic for a viral infection, you would never call that person anti-antibiotic, right? So when people are questioning vaccine safety or vaccine efficacy or vaccine necessity, that does not make them anti-vaccine. That makes them pro-science and pro-common sense and pro-public health. The truth is, we all care about the same thing. We care about having healthy children and a healthy population. Nobody is anti or pro-vaccine. We are all pro-kid and pro-health. And questioning certain aspects of our current CDC vaccine schedule is actually really important if we want to make sure that our kids are safe and healthy.
I agree with Dr. Margulis. We all care about the same thing. We all want to make sure that our kids are safe and healthy. That's it. I think we can all agree on that, right? This docuseries will be focused on the scientific integrity of vaccine studies, the safety and efficacy of about a dozen particular vaccines that are in the CDC's current schedule, and the vitally important topic of vaccine freedom of choice. I don't want my opinions to get in the way of scientific facts, nor do I want to influence anyone to do anything against their own conscience. My goal is to present the truth so that you, the viewing audience, can make an educated decision for you and your own family. What's the theory behind vaccines? I asked Dr. Paul Thomas, a board-certified pediatrician from Portland, Oregon, this very question. What is the theory behind vaccines? Why do they work? Or what's the theory behind why they work?
Well, before I get into that, I just want to mention what we've lost in this whole vaccine discussion is that what really keeps us healthy is a strong immune system, all right? Now, having said that, is it possible to use your immune system and promote some aspect of it so you develop immunity against something that might be causing harm? And I think the theory of vaccination goes way back to smallpox, cowpox, Jenner, and all those pioneers. And they were able at that time to take a little bit of something that was causing disease or that was similar to it and get it under the skin and get your body to mount an immune response so that in the future, when you got exposed to smallpox, let's say, your body was ready to go, right? So in a simplistic term, I think that's what we're trying to do with vaccines. We're trying to prime the immune system with the organism that's been killed or pieces of the organism that's enough for the body to recognize it, and you develop antibodies so that next time you're exposed, your immune system reacts quickly and you don't actually get sick. So you'll have a huge immune response. And to some extent we've been successful, but where we've lost, we may have won a battle, but we've lost the war, in my opinion, is the collateral damage.
We will be looking at the collateral damage, to use Dr. Thomas' exact words, over the next week. Vaccinations are credited with the reduction and even elimination of several diseases, including whooping cough, diphtheria, tetanus, polio, measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis B, smallpox, meningitis, and influenza. If a person develops a positive antibody response following a vaccination, then that vaccination is considered to be successful, and that person is believed to be immune to the disease. We will address this topic, antibodies, in the next episode.
I am a member of the Academy of Pediatrics. We're supposed to be, the Academy of Pediatrics, the organization that guards the health of children. And when it comes to vaccines, which is what we're going to be talking about, I feel like the Academy has not been as thorough as perhaps I would like them to be in investigating what's going on.
That really sums up the reason that we produced this docuseries. We need more investigation, we need more discussion, and we need more honest debate. But the two diametrically opposing positions of those who are pro-vaccine and those who are anti-vaccine have resulted in a climate where civil discussion rarely takes place, where there's much more name-calling and pejoratives. This has created a climate that is not conducive to true debate or discussion.
In today's climate, you have the get your kid vaccinated now. And then you have a growing climate of don't vaccinate your kid. Now, neither standpoint allows for owning a decision and understanding why you make that decision.
The moment you question the safety of vaccines, you are a quack. The moment you bring up any issue with safety, you could be pro-vaccine, but if you bring up one safety issue, you're automatically a quack. We have Nobel laureates who've brought this out, right? These are Nobel laureates, and suddenly they're being called quacks and idiots and crazies because they're questioning the safety of vaccines.
I think it's one of the most disturbing facts of our time that you can't even speak to the thing, the basic facts like vaccine inserts that state that all of these potential harms are possible and have been observed previously, and you can't even speak to them without being called an anti-vaxxer, whatever that's supposed to mean.
A big part of making wise medical decisions is the concept of informed consent.
The idea behind informed consent is that whenever you do a medical procedure, you have to talk to the patient about the benefits of the procedure, the possible complications with the procedure, and the other options that you may have. So with vaccinations, you have to talk about what are the positives of vaccinating your child, what are the potential negatives of vaccinating your child, and what are the alternatives. And one of the alternatives always has to be not vaccinating or spacing out the vaccines. And the problem is that doctors are incredibly busy. They're getting, they have less than 15 minutes in the office with a family. They hand them a piece of paper that comes from the CDC. That's not informed consent. That's not really saying to them, okay, look at this is really the pluses and minuses. And the problem is that most doctors in America haven't actually taken the time to do the fundamental research that they need to do to figure out what the true risks and benefits are of any given vaccine. So in this country, we don't really have informed consent when it comes to vaccines.
There's a term that I remember vividly being taught in medical school, and that's iatrogenic. So iatrogenic is caused by what we do. All right, if you take
what a doctor does.
Exactly. Okay. So if you take a medicine that I prescribe and it makes you ill or causes you harm, that's iatrogenic. All right? And I think we've lost our way in looking at vaccines and looking at what are the iatrogenic effects. In other words, what harm is being done by our vaccine program. So the dilemma I was in 2008 after I had those 4 cases of children who regressed into severe autism, and I'd already learned about toxicity. I'd read studies on thimerosal, on aluminum toxicity. I mean, there's books on this topic. I could no longer ethically keep doing vaccines business as usual with the CDC schedule. And the things that concerned me the most were that hepatitis B dose for newborns. Back then they weren't pushing vaccines on pregnant women. That's happened since. And the sheer number of vaccines that were being given, for example, at the 2-month visit, we were giving 6 different vaccines, 3 of which had too much aluminum. So you're multiplying huge toxins, adding on top, and it was just clearly not a scientifically justifiable approach when you understand toxicity.
If you're going to give parents informed consent before they take these vaccines, Don't just tell them that the vaccine was responsible for lowering the incidence of cases of measles. Tell them that there's studies that if you take this, showing that if you take this measles vaccine, you're statistically significantly more likely to be hospitalized after receiving that vaccine. Okay? You're more likely to have epileptic seizures. You're more likely to have allergies as a result of that vaccine. Okay? That's well documented. You're more likely to develop cancers and heart disease in later life if you've taken that vaccine, because it has suppressed you from being able to develop those protective effects that you gain when you are exposed to that disease naturally as a child. So if you want informed consent, you have to have all of that information, access to all of that information, so that then you can make an informed decision, and then you have to be free to accept or reject vaccines.
Vaccines were not very much discussed in medical school, other than this is what vaccines do. They save lives, they protect people from disease, and this is the schedule you need to use in your pediatric clinics to give to kids. Started medical school in 1983, and it wasn't until 1998 that a mother came over to me and said, "Dr. Larry, did you know that there's mercury in vaccines?" And I said, "No." And instead of just pushing it aside and saying, it's just such a small amount, it doesn't matter, I actually started looking to see what else is in vaccines. And I realized that there's a great amount of material in vaccines that impairs many cell structures and cell functions.
I really didn't think about vaccines very much throughout my career, because I don't know if you know this, but medical doctors really aren't taught anything about what's in vaccines or the contents or the problems that can happen after vaccination. We're basically given a sheet of paper during a pediatric rotation and told this is the schedule and to keep up with it. And so the thinking there is, I just got to make sure that everybody's got the ones that they need and which ones they need, and not really critically thinking about it at all. I used to think it was just me because I was an adult internist, but when you look at people like Dr. Larry Pilevsky and Dr. Tony Bark, who actually specialized in pediatrics, and you hear the same thing from them, then you realize that medical schools are not providing this information, and there's no incentive to go and look. There's not a lot of time during residency, so unless something's really a problem, you're not going to go trying to disprove a well-proven theory or practice. Nobody does it.
I've got a daughter in medical school and a really good friend in medical school, and I've asked them, because they're already being taught vaccines are safe and effective, and they're the best thing you can do to further the health of the population. They're already being taught this. And I was never taught when I was in medical school 30 years ago what was in a vaccine. We were only taught that they're wonderful and do them. So no, most doctors trained today have no idea what's in the vaccines.
When I went to medical school, I graduated in 1985, and at that period of time, when I went on into practice, there were only 3 vaccines really that were used in children. There was DPT, MMR, and polio. And it wasn't until 1991 when there was the big ramp up of the vaccine schedule, starting with the hepatitis B vaccine at birth, and then they added the Hib, and then chickenpox and Prevnar, and now we have 46 doses of 16 vaccines that are given to children by the time they're 5 years of age. So I would say that when I was in medical school, there wasn't much to talk about. There was only the 3 vaccines. But then we had this big ramp up. So anybody who's graduated from medical school and gone through a residency program from 1991 forward, which has been 25 years, the only thing that they're told is here's the schedule and here's how you give it. And you really need to deal with those parents who are doing this whole thing called vaccine hesitancy now, which is being published in all of the medical literature, saying that all of these crazy people, why wouldn't they want vaccines? They're actually even combing information off of Facebook of the arguments that people get into and try to come up with arguments to convince more and more people why they should be vaccinated.
But let's get back to our focus on the current CDC vaccine schedule, which is one of the things that almost every doctor is taught while in medical school. When I was a baby in 1968, I think I got about 3 or 4 vaccines in total, and I was considered to be fully vaccinated. But in order to be fully vaccinated today, it's much different.
What we have now is 69 doses of 16 vaccines that the federal government is saying all the children should use from day of birth to age 18. back when my children were receiving vaccines in the late 70s and 80s, it was 23 doses of 7 vaccines. So we've had a tripling of the numbers of doses of vaccines that children are now getting. And in that time period, as this dramatic escalation of the child vaccination schedule has occurred, what have we seen? Have we seen children be healthier? Just the opposite. We have an epidemic of chronic disease and disability. 1 child in 6 in America now learning disabled. 1 in 9 with asthma. 1 in 50 with autism. 1 in 400 developing diabetes. Millions more with inflammatory bowel disorders, rheumatoid arthritis, epilepsy. Epilepsy is on the rise. We have children who, 30% now of young adults have been diagnosed as having a mental illness, an anxiety disorder, bipolar, schizophrenia. This is the worst public health report card in the history of this country. And it has coincided perfectly with the tripling of the numbers of vaccines.
If a pediatrician does not abide by the standards of vaccination and promulgate them, then they themselves become legally liable for being sued. So even if they're open and they're like, oh, well, she doesn't want to vaccinate according to the schedule, and then someone actually gets injured or gets an infection, then they themselves could be legally liable, whereas they are completely expunged of all liability if they follow without any thought the vaccine schedule.
When I was a kid, I got smallpox vaccine and I got polio vaccine, and that was it. My kids received 69 doses of 16 vaccines.
So here we have public health officials screaming from the rooftops that parents must do this vaccine schedule exactly as it is put out by the CDC, while themselves in their own families are choosing not to follow it. Whenever I have a doctor who I talk to who says I alternate the schedule, I say, would you share that? Can I use your name? And they say, I don't want to lose my job. Or I don't want people to know, or I'm choosing not to do these vaccines because I know they're not effective, or I know they're not necessary, but you can't let anybody know. And I'm a journalist, and I'm bound to journalistic ethics, and I could never reveal who those people are, but I can tell you that I have spoken to them myself, and they have told me the truth. And the truth is that they are alternating the schedule in their own families for their own children.
Why would CDC employees not follow their own vaccine schedule? Why would pediatricians not follow their own vaccine recommendations to their own patients? In medical schools across the globe, physicians are taught that the current CDC schedule has been proven to be safe and effective.
In 2013, the Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Sciences, issued a report that said that the current federally recommended child vaccine schedule of 49 doses of 14 vaccines given between day of birth and age 6 has not been adequately studied for safety. And one of the issues was that the vaccines may have been studied separately, but they have not been studied in the combined schedule, including giving 8 to 10 vaccines on one day. So that is something the Institute of Medicine has acknowledged. The federal government disagrees, but I think everybody needs to understand that child vaccine schedule has not been adequately studied for safety. Fewer than 40 studies have actually studied the schedule. That's not enough studies to prove that that schedule is safe or effective.
Plus there haven't been any studies at looking at the synergistic effects of the ingredients. So if you have one metal, what does it do to the body? If you have one metal and another metal, what does that do to the body? If you have one metal and antibiotics, what does that do to the body? And it's already been shown that metal detoxification in the presence of antibiotics is diminished versus metal detoxification without antibiotics. You have metal, antibiotic, then you have microorganism. What is the synergistic effect of that? So none of those amplified studies or the look at the amplification of one ingredient's effect on another have ever been done.
The studies in this book, Miller's Review of Critical Vaccine Studies, this book, there's 400 studies in here. And these are studies, most of these studies are recent studies. These are all studies that are showing problems with vaccines, because I got tired of hearing medical doctors saying there are no studies that show that vaccines are a problem, that vaccines are unsafe. What are you talking about? That is an outright lie. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of studies published in peer-reviewed journals documenting safety and efficacy problems associated with vaccines.
The consensus around vaccines is just like tobacco science. You know, would we have fought for tobacco science? There was a time when every doctor was saying smoking cigarettes is good for you, or at least it's not bad for you. I mean, that existed, and the industry was just paying for tons and tons of science to be done that supported that issue. That's what's happening in vaccines.
Did you know that since the late 1980s, vaccine manufacturers cannot be sued?
The vaccine makers have been protected by Congress under the Vaccine Injury Act.
And I think vaccine companies went to Congress and said, we're going to stop making vaccines, and that's going to be a national security problem, because if there's a bioterrorism attack, or if there is an epidemic, there's going to be no factories that are up and running that can create new vaccines that can respond to those national emergencies. And so if you want us to continue to make vaccines, you're going to have to give us immunity from litigation. And that's what happened.
If you're a surgeon, you can't go into the OR without liability insurance. What business do you know is allowed to practice and offer its service without liability insurance?
And what product that carries a risk of injury or death, what other product is mandated to be used by every single person born in this country multiple times? And there's no liability for anybody.
The vaccine industry has absolute legal immunity. In other words, they push all the risks of their toxic interventions onto the individuals, the families, the moms and dads. They take no risk whatsoever. They could put anything in a vaccine, and to some extent they do. They put known neurotoxins in the vaccines. It's criminal. It's criminal what they do to our fellow human beings.
Kids will have seizures after vaccines, and we'll say, oh, well, that's normal, because you can have febrile seizures, and that's a normal thing. We're taught that febrile seizures are normal. And are they? I don't know. Let's look at the unvaccinated and the vaccinated. Let's follow them and see, do the unvaccinated have febrile seizures as well? SIDS. I'm trained to think that that's just normal. We don't know what causes it, but it's normal. Well, let's look at the unvaccinated and the vaccinated and see if they both have the same amount of SIDS. Neurological problems, autism, which remember is the tip of the iceberg. What about all the ADD, the ADHD, the autism spectrum, the anxiety and the depression that we're seeing? And we're not even talking about all the autoimmune stuff we're starting to see at higher levels, diabetes type 1, and we're seeing way more allergies and eczema, and you're hearing more and more about people with peanut allergies that have to carry EpiPens around. Would that still be in that unvaccinated arm? Would they have all those same levels of these disorders, these chronic diseases that we're seeing in kids? I'd love to see this study be done. That's what we need to do.
I think there's a government-industry collaboration to promote vaccination. And everyone in our country, especially the doctors who don't know how to recognize vaccine injury, should know that there's a vaccine injury compensation program, should be familiar with the types of injuries that occur, and be receptive to it, and report it to the vaccine adverse event reporting system so that we can monitor what's going on. That's not happening.
What we see on VIRS is not 1/10 of the injury, which is what the government says. The government says it's probably 1/10, right? It's probably 1/1000th. And I say that because I didn't know to report to VIRS. I ran a pediatric emergency room. I trained in pediatrics.
And you didn't know you're supposed to report vaccine injuries?
No. And we had in our ER, when I was a student, when I was a medical student, a resident, and running the ER, we certainly saw kids, and I would moonlight at other hospitals even, that came in who had stopped breathing or had seizures after they'd been in the vaccine clinic. Nobody reported that. Nobody went and said this has to be reported.
Didn't even know?
No. It was kind of like we knew that happened, okay, but they didn't get reported. So think how many don't get reported.
Doctors are not taught what a vaccine adverse reaction looks like. In fact, when a parent calls the doctor and says, my child was vaccinated, I can't wake him up, he'll only wake up to feed, he's sleeping for 2 days, the parent is told that's normal. And when the parent raises the question, could this have been from the vaccine? Meanwhile, the kid had never done that before. The doctor almost unanimously says, no, it's just a coincidence. That kid suffered brain damage. Sleeping for 2 days as an infant, not waking up other than to feed. That kid was brain damaged. Had brain inflammation. Not waking up for 2 days other than to feed is a neurological event. That's not normal. And that's from the injection of material into the brain.
1989 is the year that this epidemic of childhood illnesses began. Autism, ASD, ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, something called misery disorder, which I've never heard of before. Tics is Tourette's syndrome and a family of grave neurological injuries that became epidemic that year. SIDS, narcolepsy, seizure disorders, things that, and of course food allergies and asthma. And all of those things began in 1989. On all of those illnesses, there's science today, there's science out there that indicates that those illnesses are being caused by thimerosal or adjuvants like aluminum or squalene or some other vaccine association.
Something is happening to the brains of our children. Something is interfering with the normal neurosequencing of brain development. Because when babies are born, their brain is not developed. When babies are born, they have more nerve cells than their brains need. And it's through life experience that the tracks are laid down to create the proper sequencing of muscular development, speech development, cognitive development, and emotional development. Something is interfering with the proper sequence of those steps. Something is getting in the way of the brain developing properly. No one is asking the question, why?
Ryan was severely vaccine injured. I thought, I have to get the word out. I can't let this happen to other children. And I was one of many, and we thought people are going to want to hear this. First thing I did, I wrote to the pediatrician who we no longer went to, but the pediatrician who vaccinated him. Wrote her a 5-page letter about all that had transpired, including not being able to get through to her when our son nearly was killed by his vaccines. And then I called to follow up to make sure she'd received the letter. And I said, you know, what makes you so confident that these vaccines that you're giving day in and day out are safe, that they're not harming kids? And she said, and I quote, she had a 1-sentence answer for me. This was pretty much the end of our phone call. She said, because the pharmaceutical reps tell me they're safe. So, you know, the very people who are profiting from these products are the ones claiming their safety. They're also the ones who are allowed to do their own studies and tell the FDA, another safe vaccine, we want you to approve it. Right around age 2, I figured it out on my own with no help from my pediatrician. I woke up one morning, it was a Sunday morning, I'll never forget it, and a neon light in my mind, the word autism, and I just truly believe that was divine intervention. That was the day. I had just had my 3rd child 3.5 weeks prior to that, and I think God wanted me to get through that pregnancy before the bombshell and hit that there was something really wrong with our 2-year-old. And so he was subsequently diagnosed with autism, which is a term I hate to use because it is what the medical authorities and government entities and pharmaceutical companies have coined to divert the blame from themselves. It's really encephalopathy that he has. He has brain damage, catastrophic brain damage from his vaccines. He also has immune system damage. He has been tested. He makes antibodies to his myelin basic protein that covers every nerve sheath in your body. So you can imagine if your body is attacking that sheath on every nerve cell, your nervous system is not going to work. He has GI issues. He has heavy metal toxicity.
he has been greatly harmed by routine childhood vaccinations, and I refuse to call them immunizations. Vaccination most certainly does not equal immunization in any sense of the word. So he's now 22, a boy in a man's body, 6 feet 4 inches tall, 180 pounds. On a good day, he has the cognitive abilities of a 5-year-old. He must be cared for 24/7, 365 while I'm here interviewing with you. A former tutor of his is taking care of him for 2 days. It's not normal to have to hire a babysitter to care for a 22-year-old man, but unfortunately it's becoming the norm in our country. He still works with tutors 40 hours a week. We do a special behavioral program that helps them to learn new things and maintain that which we've already taught. And he's not able to work. He could not imagine a 4 or 5-year-old holding down a job. It's not going to happen. He's never gone on a date, and he never will. He's not going to get married. He's not going to have children. He's been robbed of leading the life that he would have lived had we not vaccinated him. And it's, as a mother, it's painful. If I could have one do-over, one do-over in life, no vaccines for any of my children.
We start from the position of what we're for, not against. We are not against anything. We're for our kids. And if you could show us that anything is going to benefit our children, we're all in. And we showed that by believing whatever the medical community, and I'm not against the medical community, said to do about vaccines, and we did it. And so as a DA, as a prosecutor, I deal with circumstantial evidence, and I look at motives, right? And so all we did that really started a storm in our community and really internationally was share our testimony and give our opinion. Share our testimony and give our opinion. Our testimony is our journey with our son about how he was developing normally. We have the pictures like so many other families. Hundreds of thousands of other families share our story. We have pictures, we have video, he's reaching all his milestones, then something happened. Something happened, there was some intervening cause that made our son not be normal and not develop the way he was. And so we have to ask ourselves, what was that? We didn't drop him, we didn't get in a car accident, he wasn't exposed to any chemicals other than vaccines, and that was the only intervening cause. And it was immediate, it wasn't like it was months developing, a year, not even a week, it was immediate. I mean, it was almost like we were driving down the road, got in a car accident, we walk away, but our son doesn't. It was that type of an event.
We have 4 children, so we kind of went the same route with the first 2, Maya and Michael, who were vaccinated, and Maya even had some reactions as well with the skin allergy and hives, breaking out in hives, and then our 2 youngest one, Leah and Zaiter, have never been vaccinated. They're completely, I mean, the way they develop is completely different.
It's apples and oranges. I tell people that we became an unintentional study. We have 2 children that we followed the schedule. And again, we didn't know any better, we followed the schedule. And our first daughter, tremendous hives. After like 4 or 6 months, I don't remember which round, they thought it was an autoimmune disease. First-time parents were freaking out. We had some fool actually tell Davi that she was allergic to breast milk, which is insane. And you know, she loves breastfeeding her children. And poked her and prodded her. Nobody gave us an answer. So we just kind of went on. We just didn't know. We didn't know anything about it. We didn't even think about vaccines. I mean, when it happened immediately after also, but God forbid anybody blames the vaccines. And so, and to this day, Maya, and we're in the process of detoxing her too. We have to look at her, even though she hasn't been vaccinated since she was 3, and she's 8 now. In my common sense approach, I look at 1 in 15,000 children that were autistic in the 70s when I was born, early 70s. And today, as you and I speak, it's 1 in 43. And with a projection, as you know, in 16 years of being 1 in 2, and people are just going to sit around and be politically correct and not worry about it?
We learned earlier that vaccine manufacturers cannot be sued if a person is damaged or even killed due to a vaccine. But I'm sure that you've heard of large settlements being paid to families of vaccine-injured children, right? Like the Hannah Poling case. Hannah's father, John, is a Harvard-trained medical doctor and neurologist, and in 2008, he claimed that Hannah's autistic symptoms were caused by a vaccine reaction after she had received 5 vaccines, the DTaP, Hib, MMR, varicella, and polio, at the age of 18 months. Here's what's interesting. Hannah had been part of a study of normally developing children prior to being diagnosed with autism and had received an advanced brain imaging technology being developed by Harvard University. Her father, John, was able to present compelling evidence that the vaccine reaction was causative of Hannah's autism. The vaccine court ruled in favor of polling, stated that there was sufficient evidence to conclude that vaccines given to Hannah polling likely aggravated an underlying mitochondrial disease causing brain damage with features of autism. The polling family was awarded $1,507,284. Edward Jenner was born in 1749 in Berkeley, Gloucester.
And Jenner noted, as other people did, is that girls who got cowpox from milking cows were protected against smallpox. And all that led to him then practicing on his son, experimenting on his son and his next door neighbor, and giving them multiple doses of this very, very crude extract of cowpox. And ultimately, I believe, leading to catastrophic failure in their immune systems and death of both children later as young adults. So not an experiment that you would necessarily consider well-designed or a good outcome.
Dr. Wakefield said that Jenner actually inoculated his own son and neighbor with smallpox. The neighbor boy's name was James Phipps, and he was only 8 years old when he was initially inoculated. Over the next 12 years, Jenner's son and James Phipps both were inoculated over a dozen times. Phipps died at the age of 20, and Jenner's own son died at the age of 21, both from tuberculosis. Since then, the smallpox vaccine has been linked to tuberculosis. Vaccinations became mandatory in England in 1853, and by 1857, fines and imprisonment awaited people who refused to be vaccinated against smallpox. Dr. Humphreys just mentioned that once smallpox vaccinations became mandatory in England, massive epidemics began to occur. According to official figures of the Register General of England, between 1857 and 1859, there were over 14,000 deaths from smallpox. Then, between 1863 and 1865, there were over 20,000 smallpox deaths. A few years later, there were almost 45,000 smallpox deaths between 1870 and 1872. But England wasn't the only place to make smallpox vaccinations mandatory. It happened in the United States too. In 1855, Massachusetts enacted forced smallpox vaccination laws. Similar to what happened in England, following the 1855 mandate, there were smallpox epidemics in 1859, 1860, 1864, 65, and 67, culminating with the infamous epidemic in 1872 and 1873. Similar events occurred in Germany, Japan, Scotland, Ireland, Sweden, Italy, Holland, Austria, and Japan during the late 1800s. As vaccination rates increased, so did the incidence and deaths from smallpox. I won't go into all the graphs and numbers, but they're readily available.
The doctors of the time were, saying that this is absurd, that we're still seeing plenty of smallpox in people who have been cowpox vaccinated, and that this vaccine is far from safe, that people were having major issues from it. Deaths were happening. In some cases, in the years that the vaccine was being used, the hospitalization rates and death rates for smallpox were higher than the years before the vaccine was even invented. Then there was, this episode in a city called Leicester in England at the time where they had a 95% infant vaccination rate and had some of the worst epidemics in history in that city. And so people were outraged because mandatory vaccination had been instituted, people were being arrested and their belongings confiscated. Horrible. And we went through a lot of these stories in the book. And so people had had enough, and so they demonstrated. And so there was this great demonstration, which is one of our chapters. And there was a big rally with over 80,000 people that showed up. I mean, these people were angry. Their kids were getting really messed up from this vaccine, and it wasn't working. So it's one thing to take the risk of getting a vaccine if it's working, but in this case, it was lose-lose for them. So they decided they were going to stop vaccinating. And instead, whenever somebody had smallpox, they had people that were already immune tend to the person, and they sanitized everything in their midst and kept them isolated. And that turned out to be actually the best way to deal with smallpox in communities.
Quarantine and isolation, according to Dr. Wakefield, led to the eradication of smallpox. And Dr. Humphreys just mentioned a rally in Leicester, England in 1885 where 80,000 people got together and protested mandatory vaccines. They actually won their freedom of choice. In today's vernacular, oftentimes the terms vaccination and immunization are used interchangeably. But are they the same thing? Explain the difference.
Vaccination is not immunization. So your body has a natural process of immunization in response. It's an adaptive response to exposure to, for example, live viruses that are all around us. You immunize yourself when you are exposed to a virus Your body recognizes it because you have this functioning immune system, the blueprints of which are built into every cell of your body. You're a biochemical master of immunization. Yeah. You would not be alive if your ancestors weren't really, really good at this. So we immunize ourselves naturally all the time through exposure to viruses that make some people sick. Well, who do they make sick? The people who are vaccinated. Why is that? Because the vaccines harm the immune system, they compromise the immune system, they weaken the immune system. A healthy immune system, practicing healthy immunization, is in people like you and I. I haven't been vaccinated since I was a kid, and I haven't been sick in over a decade. Why is that? Am I somehow, have I been able to avoid all viruses? No. I'm shaking people's hands, I'm in public spaces, people cough on my food just like they cough on your food. Why am I not sick? Because my body is exhibiting its own immunization without vaccination.
Immunization has nothing to do with vaccines themselves. So people have to start using these two words correctly. If they really conferred immunity, they wouldn't have to keep giving these booster shots. Real immunity is for life.
Our bodies were designed to create it, to develop an immune response, and when they're healthy, they create it. So when you're exposed to an infectious agent, it's going to form the protective antibodies. Not only for a short term like you do with vaccines, but it's going to do it virtually indefinitely, and in most cases lifelong. You have lifelong permanent immunity when you have a healthy immune system and you're exposed to an infectious agent. That's the ideal. You know, now they're doing these vaccines and it's like, well, maybe every 10 years, maybe every 5 years. You know, they're on third, fourth boosters of DPT now. It's going to be 10 boosters. You're going to have to get it every year. It's just insane because it's not the way the body was designed to create an immune response. When you do it artificially, it's almost universally going to be less than ideal.
The way you naturally develop an immune response is through breathing a virus in the air or breathing it into your nose, never being injected directly into your bloodstream.
I know how medical establishment is operating and that doctors have to follow certain protocols. And if they were to understand that if they follow these protocols and they harm people, it would be very hard for them as humans to do that. So the establishment is making everything possible to prevent doctors from realizing that what they're doing might be harmful. Therefore, you have these studies that seemingly deny what is obvious to the eye.
Why is this taboo? Why can't we do rigorous scientific studies with one group that's vaccinated and one group that's not? We should have at least 30 studies like that on every vaccine, but we have 0 on every vaccine. We don't have any studies like that. And I started to become aware that something is wrong. Somebody's trying to hide something, right? As soon as it's like, oh, you can't talk about that, it's like, well, why not? Why can't we talk about it?
Dr. Wakefield, Dr. Wolfson, and Dr. Levitin are just 3 of literally hundreds, if not thousands, of doctors that have suffered professional ramifications for attempting to facilitate discussion about vaccines and for giving their patients the freedom of choice not to follow the CDC vaccine schedule. When debate and scientific questions are not allowed to be asked, when ad hominem attacks are rampant, and when name-calling is pervasive, the subject of vaccines almost becomes more of a religious type of a debate as opposed to a rational scientific debate.
It's gathered an extraordinary momentum, taking on the life of a religion rather than any kind of science or primary public health measure.
It's a sacrament in the Church of Pharmaceutical Mysticism. It is not a real scientific endeavor anymore. It's about the holy grail attempt, if you will, to achieve artificial antibody stimulation. Or they might claim that the antibodies are real, but they're not the same thing, and they don't provide the same level of immunity should you acquire and encounter the disease in the natural state. And that's a big problem, but they'd like us to believe that it isn't.
It is such a religious belief that when you present a physician or somebody who believes it and doesn't know why they believe it with contrary information, they immediately get very defensive and angry and incensed and furious. And I understand that because it means that everything they have been taught to believe is topsy-turvy and really messed up. And if that's true, then they've been lied to. I mean, they're not consciously thinking all of this, but I mean, I've analyzed why it's so, but that everything they've been taught, they've been lied to, they've been, if that's not true, then what else isn't true? And if you're a doctor, then, I've had doctors tell me, I don't want to know anymore because I'll have to change the way I practice, and I just can't do that. Like, it's overwhelming. And some doctors who are really smart can't hear it. They can't hear it, and I'm like, okay, they're yelling at me, like, you're a quack, and you're dangerous, and you're killing patients.
This is the most grounded, firmly entrenched belief in preventive medicine and health and intervention medicine, that this vaccine are crucial to be healthy. And in my belief, it's nothing could be further.
Industry hires shills, not only, so in the vaccine world, it's not just the industry. We have the CDC looking for mommy bloggers, looking to pay people to blog as though they're just lay people, but there's federal dollars going to pay these people.
And they basically
and it's to promote
do what?
Promote vaccines.
I'm convinced that 99.9% of every young adult going into medical school have a heart to serve, have a heart to help. I do believe there are some people out there in it for the money, but by far, most kids are in school trying to do what's good, and then they get indoctrinated. And you look at the research, and then you look at the textbooks, and everything is formulated in a very biased way to convince people to one direction. So you graduate after really being brainwashed for 8 years.
Most doctors are good people who are just trying to help, but they're hamstrung by a broken system which discourages questioning medical dogma, and as we saw earlier, even encourages physicians to coerce patients into accepting medical procedures to which they do not consent. I hope you've enjoyed the first episode of The Truth About Vaccines. We have 6 more episodes coming your way. Tell your friends and family, and tune back in for the next episode. Thank you, and God bless.